In this video, I'd like to go over a few tips and tricks when it comes to rain. Now, this effect has a long history with Houdini. It's probably one of the first sort of effects people tried to make when particles came around. But as a result, when you go and research rain, you'll find a lot of very complex setups, things that rely on sophisticated Vex knowledge or have some interesting sort of technical things going on. And rain has become one of those technical challenges that a lot of Houdini artists try to make for themselves. As a result of that, there are many overcomplicated techniques. So when I went to make this scene, I wanted to give myself the challenge of creating everything you see with beginner-friendly methods. And that's exactly what I did. Everything you see here in this render is beginner-friendly. Before we dive into the details, if you enjoy this video, then be sure to also check out Houdini for the New Artist too. If you're someone looking to make awesome shots while understanding Houdini on a deeper level, then this is the course for you. You see, many Houdini artists think that they've mastered the basics, when in fact they haven't. And until you understand what it takes to make an awesome shot while thinking on your own without entirely relying on tutorials, you're still a beginner. This course will help you get beyond that. For more information, check out cgforge.com. Let's now start breaking down what's going on here. First of all, it's worth mentioning that we don't have one big simulation for everything. Even though it works like that in the real world, where a raindrop falls and then it creates all the phenomenon we see, as a VFX artist, that's not the best idea. You want more control over each individual element so that if there's any changes, you have the ability to adjust things on a per element basis. So the first layer is the rain itself, right? That's just what we see in these areas. It's just particles falling. Secondly, when we go and look at the little robot dude, we'll notice that we have these tiny little droplets that fall down off of him. So we have falling droplets. Then we also have droplets along the surface here of the robots. So we have surface droplets, and they cling onto the robot here, and they slide down his face. So you'll see them slide down like that. The next thing that we have is we have tiny little puddles that appear on his head where the rain hits. So we'll call that our head rain puddles. Head rain puddles. And then off of those puddles, we have these tiny little particles that show up. So this is like an upward spray of water as a droplet falls down. So these tiny particles shoot up and away from the surface. So we'll call this our spray right there. And that's really about it. Then also, obviously, we have the volume here for the eyes and the light that's happening. And the other thing that we can talk about is the shading. How to make something look like it's in a rainstorm, like it's wet. In this video, we're just going to cover the rain. There's actually a lot of things to think about with this rain simulation. And if you'd like to watch how I made everything here, then visit Houdini for the New Artist too, because I've included a breakdown as a bonus section to that course. When many Houdini artists go in to do this kind of effect, what they do is they go right into the scene and they say, you know what? I know what rain looks like. I don't know why this whole thing is such a big deal, because they're just particles falling down, right? So we have a new network right here. And let's say that this is our robot dude. We don't have anything else going on. And we'll create a circle right here. And we'll go ahead and just set this so that we have a circle above the robot. That circle spawns particles, and then it just rains down on our robot dude. So here's our circle, and then we say, all right, well, pop network. We want a particle sim, and we're just going to scatter onto the surfaces. So we have that. We'll throw down gravity, and then if they get down to a certain point, we'll just have something that kills them off. So maybe a pop kill. All right, well, there's some particles right there. We have it raining down. All I need to do now is just turn this up, right? We go to the birth, maybe add a 0, give ourselves some more particles, and there we go. Now we have rain. Let's go ahead and apply a shader now. So we'll just go in here and first of all set P scale. That's going to be the size of each rain droplet. So I'll do an attribute create, and we're going to make P scale. This is a float attribute. It has decimal values in it. And let's just say that I set it to, I don't know, something I made up in my head, like 0.01. Who knows if that works? We're just gonna go with it, right? Next up, material network. Let's make a shader for this. And for that, I'm going to just make a water shader because after all, rain is water, is it not? So there's that, and let's just go ahead and take the roughness down to 0. That gives us very sharp highlights. The IOR is a value of 1.33 for water. And then we go down to the transmission. This is what makes it transparent. So now we can see through this thing. Okay, so then on our network here, I'll go up to the material, and let's just go ahead and find our water material. Like that. Let's go through our camera, hit render. All right, there's a rain droplet. Looks pretty good, I'd say. Maybe a little bit big, so I'll go back and change P scale. I'm just using my eyes, you know, just kind of saying, all right, well, I think it just needs to be a little bit lower. And then I guess the last thing is motion blur, right? We go here and we say, let's go to redshift, advanced, and turn on the motion blur, and we'll turn on this particles blur right there. Let's hit play again and see what this looks like. And there we go. Now we have some motion blur streaks on the screen, and that's rain. Done and done. Well, if you can't tell, I'm being sarcastic. That is technically the right general idea of how to do rain, but it's also entirely wrong in how I approach this. And this is really important, I think, to understand if you want to be a high quality effects artist. You can be correct in the general idea of how to do something, but you can be totally wrong when it comes to the details. And those details are really what make a great effects artist different than everyone else. So let me go over a few things that are wrong about what I just did. Number one, I did not look at reference. That's a huge deal. That's a really bad idea. Anytime you go into a Houdini project thinking that you know what something looks like and not looking at reference, you will almost always find yourself getting in trouble at some point or another. If not now, then later you certainly will, and it'll cost a lot of time. So it's a rookie mistake to not look at reference. The other issue with this is that there's no breakup. There's nothing that would make this not feel like CGI. So that's not ideal. And even though this is a still frame, and maybe you think this looks good when it's not moving, when you render this out, which might take hours eventually, then in the animation, you might notice that something feels very off about it. Something feels mechanical in a way. The other issue with what I just did is that I was making up values. I was guessing the scale of a particle. I was just kind of like, I don't know, maybe 0.1's good. I wasn't thinking about the speed. How fast does a raindrop actually go? Because that, dictates the shape of the motion blur here. And, well, that's going to make a difference as to whether or not this is realistic, right? So I didn't measure the speed. I wasn't using any kind of real world values. I was just kind of like, whatever. That's an issue. The other rookie thing about this is that even though technically we are looking at water in rain here, this also is increasing our render times because we have lots of motion blur on a transparent object. We have transparent objects overlapping each other. that creates a lot of this grain that we see right here. And in order to render out that grain cleanly, it's going to take a major hit on our render times in general. So even though technically this is water, also technically we just killed our render times, and that's going to be a big issue down the road. So you see, if you're not careful about all of this stuff, it can come around to haunt you later. The point is, and the reason why I'm talking about this, is that if you're not careful, rain in particular is going to fool you into thinking that this is an easy situation. Let's head over to reference and try to do this a bit more properly now. Let's now take a look at what actual rain looks like when you take video footage of it. So starting here with this, we have these rain streaks. They're very, very noticeable. It almost looks like a bright white snow. Also take a look at their movement. We have these meandering particles that are happening. It's not just a downward motion either. So that's really interesting. Compare this footage to what we get when we have something like this. You can barely even tell that there are droplets here. And the rain just looks like a bit of volume, a bit of atmospheric fog. We can tell the rain's hitting stuff with the interaction here, but we actually don't see any motion blur streaks. So that's kind of crazy, right? Then let's take a look at something like this. Same deal. It's raining, but the only way you know that is because of how things look and because of the tiny little interactions we have with these puddles. Then we go over to something like this. Very, very noticeable. So the reference is all over the place, depending on the kind of rain you want to make, depending on the lighting conditions, how close you are to the rain. This whole effect changes entirely depending on the reference that you're looking at. Just a couple more to really emphasize this here for a moment. This is more of like a mid-ground rain. And this is actually closer to what we'll do in our scene here. But there's that. It's about midway through. It only shows up where the light is. We also have something close up. Can't even tell. Not really. Then we go close up again. And look at this. All of a sudden, we see tons of droplets again. So what I'm going to do is pick a couple of different references to give me a general direction of the sort of look that I want here. I like the look of the rain right here. I like the rain to be noticeable. So we're going to have that. I also feel like this is a smaller robot. So the closer up you get to something, the bigger the raindrops appear. And then if we take that reference and combine it with something like this, something that's a bit more steady, and then maybe we even throw on a little bit of this swirly motion to kind of weave in and out of it. The combination of some of these things I'm noticing in the reference can be goals that I set for myself when I go out to make this effect. Let's also find some real-world values. Average raindrop size, about 2 millimeters, okay? Anywhere from 0.02 millimeters to 5 millimeters. My face is covering this, but take my word for it. That's about the size of a raindrop, and some of them are bigger and some of them are smaller. Let's also ask, how fast does a raindrop fall? Right here. And, well, as we can see, let me actually move my face now. It depends on the size. So that's interesting. Small raindrops might move about 2 to 7 feet per second. Okay, that's 16 miles an hour. Medium raindrops might be a bit more. Large raindrops are 20 miles an hour. So depending on the size, that's going to determine how fast it can fall. The other interesting thing is that eventually this reaches something called terminal velocity. So what that means is that as a raindrop is falling, it reaches a point where the air resistance is fighting against gravity. And that keeps the speed of something consistent. So once a raindrop reaches, let's say, 9 meters per second, if it's a larger raindrop, then it stays at 9 meters per second. Also, if it's a smaller raindrop, that speed is going to be less than 9. Because remember, we have the smaller raindrops over here. So in our logic, we want to find a way to make our small raindrops reach a terminal velocity once it, hits a certain speed. Same with our medium, same with our large. And that's going to really improve the accuracy of the movement here. So now with all that in mind, it's going to drastically change our setup here. Let's go back to our network, and I want to figure out all of this data before we hit the solver. Starting with the size of the droplets. And we want to have a random size, right? So what if we did an attribute randomize? There we go. We'll do that for p-scale. Raindrops can get up to 5 millimeters, but I'm not trying to make a super heavy rain. So let's just aim for around 2 millimeters in general, and then we'll just go a little bit up and down from there. So on the minimum value, I'll say 0.001 to 0.003. Then on the dimensions, I'll set this to 1 so that we create 1 attribute value per point. If you set this to 3, it'll create 3 attribute values per point. So dimensions of 1. The next thing to think about is the speed. So we want to take our size because the speed depends on the size, and based off of the p-scale value, create a new value that is the terminal velocity of the raindrop. So whenever you want to create a new attribute based on existing data like this, try using the attribute remap node. This will take an existing attribute and allow you to create new values out of the existing ones. So if I say p-scale is the original name, and now the new name is going to be our term vel, like that. Let's scroll down to the bottom. Make sure that we're not deleting anything. Let's go to the geo spreadsheet. We can see that this created a new attribute, and right now it just copies the p-scale value. So now with these settings, I can change what this is all about. The old min and max, we're going to create a relative reference. So copy parameter. Here's the input min, paste relative references. Here's the old max, copy parameter, paste relative reference to the input max. Then we want to find our new speeds. So for the smallest particle, how fast is the terminal velocity? So the range here is between 15 and 25 miles an hour. If we go to the very top and we take a look at a 15 centimeter drop, I can convert that to millimeters. That's kind of close to where we're at. That is going to be 16 miles per hour. So then if I take 16 miles per hour, and we'll just make that about 15 miles an hour to just kind of round down a little bit. So we'll say 15 miles per hour to meters per second, because that's how Houdini measures speed over time. That's 6.7 meters per second, 6.71. Let's just try 6.5 just to be pretty close, right? So the smallest raindrop is going to go 6.5 meters per second. And then our largest raindrop, let's see what that's going to be. Let's just go with a middle-ish value of 20 miles per hour. That's 8.9 meters per second. It doesn't have to be perfectly accurate as long as the logic is there and as long as it's, fairly close. So now that we have that, we have a terminal velocity that is appropriate based on the size of each particle. So now in our pop sim, I'm going to create a pop speed limit node. This will limit the speed. And I'm going to say that we want to have a maximum speed here. And I'm also going to use this expression. If you want to know how to call on any one of these parameters in here, just hover your mouse over this and it says parameter speed max. So all you say in here is speed max. That's it. That's going to equal to our term vel. And just have a @ sign there and a semicolon, and that should be good. The other thing that I'd like to do is go back to our scene and break up the source, because this source is way too even. So let's just do on our circle a remesh. We'll give ourselves some polygons to work with. So now we have a mesh like that. Then I'll use a mountain, and that's going to move these points around. So I'll bring that up, take the element size up like that, and maybe change the shape here to a purling cloud, right? So now these points spawn at different locations. It's going to help a lot. And then also we'll animate this over time so that this moves like that. There we go. So now we go to our PopNet like this. This all spawns now like so. And to double check the speed of everything, let's go to the geometry spreadsheets. And if we go to velocity, so we just do this, and I move my face here, we can take a look at the downward velocity and see what those values are doing. So if I sort by the smallest value, the most negative value, that is, we can see that sure enough, we are not going past the terminal velocity. And as we scroll down, let's say we get about midway through here, a lot of these guys are getting stopped around -6. So this is working out great. Here's another great thing about making that variation in the source. If I take our point size down here in our viewport, we can see these waves of rain. And this is much more similar to the sort of pockets of heavier rain that you would naturally see. So just by breaking up that source, we also have these different waves of rain happening. We can take that even further if we'd like by creating an attribute noise. And I'll say attribute noise float because I want to make an attribute value that deletes points if they are under a certain threshold. So let's say that I have this, right? And I'll just go ahead and take the attribute here to say mask. We'll click this so we can see these values. Then I'll go here to the element size. We'll bring this up a little bit. Again, we'll do a cloud noise. And I'm going to go here to the fractal, turn up the octaves to provide more detail and also take up the roughness. Last but not least, let's do a remap ramp and cut into this so that we have these purple areas. Those purple areas are not going to emit particles. It's going to prevent particles from spawning, and that'll break up the shape. Then we check on the animation so that over time, we create these bald spots, so to speak. Then let's go like that, add a bit more contrast. We have areas of heavy rainfall, areas of no rain falling. Then when we go to our PopNet and we source all of this in, we go to our pop source, and we want to have this emission attribute called mask. That's going to further add variation to this whole thing. So now as we can see, only the areas that are red and green, they're the areas that had point spawn, but those purple areas didn't have anything happen. So we're creating all of this breakup and variety, which is going to help a lot. We can also go in here and just add a couple layers of noise. That's not a bad idea. Or just go and add a bit of roughness to this guy as well, and that will break up the waves of rain. But as you can see, just by having a little bit more attention to the detail, this is going to make our rain simulation a lot better. Then there's the question of how many raindrops fall. If we say how many raindrops fall per cubic meter, I can make a cube in Houdini and count the number of points that are grouped in that cube. This AI overview isn't very accurate. I would actually go down here under this website. it looks like we're between 100 and 1000 per cubic meter. We'll go right in the middle and say about 500. So here is my group node. We set this to keep in bounding regions. That gives us a cubic meter. And then if I middle mouse this, our group right now has 78 points inside of that. Let's also move this around so that we just have a few areas that we sample. So I'll just do this a few times in a few different directions. And it looks like for the most part, we're anywhere from about 35 to 100 particles per cubic meter. So if I want to make this around 500 per cubic meter, then I'll just go here to our source and I will switch this over to 5 like that. I'll just multiply this times 5. Then if I go forward and I do the same thing now, we can just rerun this little test of ours. There's 206, and we can see if doing this in different areas gets us closer to 500. Right now I'm seeing between 200 and 400. So I'm going to go here and just turn this up a bit more and see if we can get closer to that 500 range. There we go. Now we have 510. There's one more thing I'd like to do with this rain. When we go back to reference, we'll notice that most things are heading down, just purely down in the Y direction, or maybe at a tiny bit of an angle. But every now and then you do see some streaks that are just kind of moseying around like this, or perhaps going sideways. So check it out. Every now and then you're going to see a gust of wind come through or something where it's moving that way. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to randomly select a small number of points and affect them by applying a turbulent noise. That's going to get them changing the direction compared to everyone else, and that's going to add a bit of realism to this whole thing. So what I like to do whenever we want to adjust something is create the attributes in SOPs first, and then we'll figure out how to do this in DOPs. That's just a personal preference of how I like to work. So I'm trying to affect the amplitude of a noise. That amplitude is going to be a float value. So attribute adjust float is what we're looking for. We'll call this our turb mask, so our turbulence mask. And right now, if I plug this into everything that's going on, and let's say I go like this as an example, I can set this to random, and it's going to randomly try to create this turbulent mask for each one of the points on the mesh. But when we go to scatter a bunch of points, those scattered points aren't actually going to be totally randomized. So I'll show you what I mean. If we were just to scatter now and go like this, let's say that I add a lot of points, I'll add even more. We don't have each point randomly assigned a value. There's still a bit of a pattern to this because the source mesh didn't have many points and it just, inherited what was there. So if I want every single point to have a different attribute value, I need to first scatter and then go into the popnet. So as an example, if I scatter first now, and then I apply the turbulent mask, now every single point actually has a different random value. This is also true, by the way, for our p-scale and for our mask that's actually unaffected. So let's just go here to our p-scale in our terminal velocity, and we're actually going to do this after we scatter as well. So we scatter, then each point randomly has a p-scale, then that dictates the terminal velocity, and now we have our turbulent mask right here. Basically put, I just want to make sure that every point is actually randomly assigned a different value. Now in the popnet, we're going to source this in differently. So we're not going to scatter on the surface. Let's say points, that is spawned from a collection of points that I give you, which is this. And then also on our scatter, let's use our mask attributes to cut into that as well. So now there's our mask attributes, reducing points in certain areas. All of our attributes are now random per points. Let's go now in the pop net. And to apply the turbulent noise, I'll do a pop force right here. And we want to use this section right here for that turbulent noise. So I'll, for right now, say a value of 7. And then we'll go down to the bottom and check on the use of expressions. Just like before, hover over the parameter you want to change. This is called amp. So amp times equals, that means multiply amplitude against our at turb mask. And that will take 7 times this attribute value right here. So now on our turb mask, I don't want this happening everywhere. I just want a few particles getting affected. So I'll take our ramp here, make most of them purple so that it doesn't affect most particles. But some of these guys are going to now be affected by a turbulent noise. And as I go forward, what we'll notice is that some of these particles now escape the main body of particles that are falling. And by the way, if you want to find an ideal number of points to scatter here, just copy your birth rate, copy parameter, and then under the scatter here, you can paste a relative reference divided by the $FPS, which is our frames per second. So that means it'll only scatter the necessary amount of points based on our birth rate in our popnet. Don't worry about that, but basically this will just make the sim a little bit faster. So there we go. Now we have these points going down, and some of them are escaping because of that noise, that turbulent noise that we added in. So let's go now to the turbulent noise. I like taking up the swirl size to something fairly large, like 15. Turn up the roughness a bit, that adds smaller details. And I'll turn up the turbulence as well, and that'll add even more smaller details so that now when we go forward, we can see larger shapes begin to emerge from those points that are affected. So now, as we go forward, we can actually see some of these guys, and the overall shape is more large and noticeable. I think it's also a decent idea just to have a tiny bit of turbulence on the whole thing. So I'll just make a copy of this and take the amplitude way down, like maybe 1.25. And we'll do something kind of like that for everything. And then just change the offset so it's a different form of that noise. And plug it in. All right, so now as we go forward, we can really see that most of these particles are going downwards in the Y direction, but now some of them will be going sideways, and hopefully that'll give us a bit of breakup in our motion blur trails so that some of them are going diagonally as they traverse across the camera. All right, well, let's now get rid of this attribute create where we had p-scale. And if we middle mouse, there's lots of information here that we don't need. So I'm also going to use a clean node, uncheck everything, remove all groups and attributes, except for, so that's Shift 6. We want to keep the ID, let's keep velocity, age, and we also want to keep p-scale. So let's just keep all of these attributes, but everything else gets deleted. Then file cache, and we're going to save this to disk. When we go to render this out, it doesn't look like much has changed, even though we just put a lot of work into this. But trust me, it's going to be a lot more noticeable in the animation. Now, there is still the issue of our render times. As I was saying before, we have transparent objects overlapping each other, and there's lots of motion blur, which creates grain. So I want to show you something interesting to get around that. And it's very simple. All you do is you go here to the transmission, you don't use transparency, and instead we just use diffuse. Look at that. It pretty much looks close to what you see in reference, except now we don't have a lot of that grain. We've gotten rid of most of that grain. And it's going to be a lot easier for our render engine to deal with this as opposed to the transmission. So a lot of times with rain, I actually suggest doing a diffuse shading like this. And it's nice too, because if I want to make the rain more noticeable, I can just brighten up that diffuse color, and it gives us the ability to fine tune how much of this that we want. I'm going to send out a test render for a couple of seconds just to get a feel of how this all looks. But also I want to mention that on the pop network here, I used 4 substeps to make sure that we have a nice, accurate simulation for the final thing. And also I want to kill any particles that intersect with our little robot. So I said pop kill, here's the guide, bounding object, and then all I did was just bring him in right here, and any particle that's inside of here will now get killed. All right, now 2 or 3 seconds have been rendered out, and I like to see what this motion is doing, so I'm going to play this on loop. There are going to be some issues up here towards the head because particles die and motion blur doesn't know what to do, but ignoring that, let's take a look at everything else. And I think this looks pretty cool. If you look closely, you can actually see there's a quick extra bit of wave of rain. And we also do have some of those particles going sideways. So this whole thing, I think, is looking really cool now. And, well, these are subtle changes, but they make a big difference when these things go to move. And when you have sims like this, those tiny things will just make everything feel a lot better. One more trick I want to add just to address that motion blur issue of the particles hanging out above his head. If you want to fix that, just go to the settings and you change the shutter center offset like that. And that will fix those floating points above his head. That'll do it for this video, and if you'd like to see a breakdown of everything else that I did to put this scene together, then go to cgforge.com and visit Houdini for the new artist too. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.